Well, Nehemiah 13, we're going to jump into that here in just a second. But before we do, let me ask you a question. Have you ever made a really big commitment with absolute language and then failed to keep it? I was talking to a friend who was going on and on and on about how he would never get a dog for his family. And he gave every reason in the world about how bad of a decision it would be and how it would ruin vacations and how it would ruin the house and the carpet and it had all this maintenance and all this stuff and how the kids would commit to taking care of the dog for a little bit, but then it would all fall back on him. And I mean, he was very, very, very convincing. And one of my biggest weaknesses is I tend to believe people. I take people at their word. And so when I hear that they will never get a dog, and when I hear every reason in the book for why it's a bad idea, mentally I'm thinking they will never get a dog, which becomes really confusing when a few weeks later they're posting pictures with their kids with their brand new golden doodle, right? So like what happened to this I will never language, right? Well, I don't know if you've ever made a big commitment to God where you're like, God, I will do this the rest of my life, or I will never do this again. And then you kind of failed to keep it. Well, if that's who you are, that's what you've done, you're in good company, all right? Like there are others who have done the same. And so today we're going to wrap up the book of Nehemiah. I want to be upfront with you. It's going to be a little bit heavy, right? It should be convicting and even a little bit discouraging at times as you're like, how do I see myself in the text? But I promise you, we're going to get to the love of Christ, and I don't want you to miss that. So if you're sitting here feeling a little bit heavy throughout the text, please, please, please hold on, because I don't want you to miss the good news of Jesus Christ, which we will come back to, or we will get to by the end of this chapter. All right, so Nehemiah, maybe it's your first Sunday at Redeemer, and you're like, we're concluding a book, and I don't even know what this book's about. Or maybe you've been here sporadically, or maybe you've been here the whole time. Let me get you caught up really, really, really quickly, okay? Around 500, the late 500s BCs, Babylon, the nation of Babylon, conquered Jerusalem, right? Completely destroys the city, completely destroys the temple, and more or less kidnaps all the people and takes them into captivity or into exile, right? And so after Babylon fades off of the world scene, the next world empire, the next world power that comes into play is Persia. Right? Under Persia, people are allowed to return to their homes, right? And so in this context, we have a guy named Nehemiah, right? Nehemiah is serving the king as his cupbearer. So he's at the right hand of the king. He has a position of influence, and he has a pretty good life getting to sample all the king's drink and all the king's food, right? Well, he gets word that his ancestral city, that the city of Jerusalem, where his family is from, is that it's in ruins, it's not safe, it's in shambles, things are really, really bad. This breaks his heart, and so what he does is he leverages his position of influence to lead the charge in returning to Jerusalem to rebuild the city, right? So there's this remnant of people in Jerusalem, and he returns to help them rebuild the city walls. Now, as he seeks to do this, we see some enemies rise up, some resistance, specifically a guy named Sanballat and his little crony, a guy named Tobiah. So we see them throughout the letter trying to resist the work of God. But miraculously, as all the people pull their own weight and come together for this greater purpose, the wall is rebuilt in 52 days, right? That's nothing short of miraculous, that the wall is rebuilt in 52 days. Well, once the physical work of the wall being rebuilt is done, God begins to work on the people spiritually, right? So they open the word of God. They find themselves convicted by what it says, and the people experience great revival, right? So they experience revival. This leads them to repentance, to confession, to change, and then that leads to them rededicating their lives to following God, where the people in chapter 10 give themselves back to God and say, we will, and they begin to use this really big, absolute commitment language. We will keep ourselves separate from that which is unholy. We will keep the Sabbath and rest and trust in in you. We will support the ministry and the work of the house of God. We will do these things. We will be the people that you've called us to be, right? And then we get to chapter 12, and it's this awesome, awesome worship service, right? Like they are now experiencing God's movement within the people. They are worshiping him for who he is. And that's where we pick up in chapter 13, right? So chapter 13, starting in verse 1, it says, on that day, this is a continuation of the worship service we saw in chapter 12. On that day, they read from the book of Moses. So they're still opening the word of God and leaning in. They read from the book of Moses in the hearing of the people, and in it was found written that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever enter the assembly of God. For they did not meet the people of Israel with bread and water, but hired Balaam against them to curse them. Yet our God turned the curse into a blessing. So let me kind of catch you up on what's going on here. If you're like, who are the Ammonites and the Moabites? Well, if you go all the way back to Genesis and read about Father Abraham, who had many sons, before he had any sons, he had a nephew. The nephew's name was Lot. Lot has some pretty jacked up stuff in his life. There's some incest with his daughters. They have two sons that become the Ammonites and the Moabites. And from that point on, the Ammonites and the Moabites, who come from this jacked up relationship with their dad Lot, right? They become avowed enemies of God's people, right? So throughout Israel's history, the Ammonites and Moabites are avowed enemies to the Jews, right? And so God here is saying they should not be in the assembly of God. And he reminds them, he's like, remember when they hired Balaam to curse you? This is another crazy story in the book of Numbers. Balaam's the guy that was riding his donkey, and he began to beat the donkey, and then the donkey began to speak back to him, which is great courage for me, because I'm like, if God can speak through a donkey, he can speak through me, right? But they're basically, some people hired this prophet to curse Israel, and God was like, no, I'm not going to let you do that. I'm actually going to take the curse and make it a blessing. But he's reminding them that, hey, these people should not be intermixed with God's people. Now, let me be really clear on this, okay? I don't want you to hear me wrong. This is not about race. This is nothing racial. This is all about spiritual influence. And so what God is saying is, I do not want people that have a negative spiritual influence to be influencing my people. All right, so the Moabites and the Ammonites had a negative spiritual influence on God's people. So God says, you need to take that which is negatively influencing you, that which is pulling your heart away from me, and you need to remove yourself from it. All right, so that's what they're being confronted with, that, hey, there are things in our lives, people that are influencing our hearts away from God. What should we do? And he says, get them out. And so how do the people respond in verse 3? As soon as the people heard the law, they separated from Israel all those of foreign descent, or they separated themselves from all the people who are negatively influencing them spiritually. Right? So if you look at the text, okay, from chapters 8 to chapters 13, verse 3, Israel is doing really, really good, right? From chapter 8 all the way to verse 3 in chapter 13, Israel is passionately following God, dedicating themselves to his word, and trying to be the people that God has called them to be. Now, in chapter 10, they make this absolute commitment language, and we're kind of asking the question, will they stick it out? Will they continue to be the people they want to be? Now, something happens between verse 3 and verse 4 of Nehemiah 13, right? Between verse 3 and 4, there's an undisclosed period of time that we don't really know how long it is. We can take a guess. But what happens is, after this day of worship, Nehemiah goes back to Persia. Right? So he had a job that he left to go and do this work in Jerusalem. He's like, I got to go back to my job. I've got to go back to that pays the bills. So he goes back to Persia, and then he eventually comes back again to Jerusalem. He's like, let me see how things are going. All right. So in verse 4, Nehemiah is now returning to Jerusalem after an extended period of time away. And we're asking the question as we're reading this text, will the people hold fast to their commitments? Will the people actually stick to their word, or will they go back on it? And what we're going to discover in verses 4 and following is that Israel literally breaks every commitment they made in chapter 10. Every commitment. I will always They go back on their word completely. So let's see this. The first commitment they break, all right? The first commitment they break is their commitment to separate from ungodly influences. We saw them do this in verses 1 and 3, but now there's a change of heart. So the first commitment they break is their commitment to separate themselves from ungodly influences. Look at verses 4 through 7. Now before this, Elishib, the priest, who was appointed over the chambers of the house of our God, and who was related to Tobiah, right, prepared for Tobiah a large chamber where they had previously put the grain offering and frankincense, the vessels and the tithes of the grain, wine and oil, which were given by commandment of the Levites, singers and gatekeepers, and the contributions for the priests. While this was taking place, I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I went to the king. And after some time, I asked leave of the king and came to Jerusalem. And then I discovered the evil that Elishib had done for Tobiah, preparing for him a chamber in the courts of the house of God. All right, so here's what's happening. Tobiah, who is a non-Israelite, who is an enemy of God's people, right, is living in a storeroom in the temple, and that storeroom is meant to hold provisions for the people who do the ministry, right? And instead of it being a storeroom, it's become a dorm room, right? And so by bringing Tobiah, a non-Israelite, into the temple, they are both defiling the temple, right? And they are bringing in ungodly influence. So they're defiling the temple and they're inviting in influence that will pull their hearts away from God. So let me give you kind of an illustration of what this would be like. I don't know if this exists. Maybe you might be like, this does exist. But imagine for me for a second. Imagine there is a professor at ETSU who's like anti-Jesus, right? I know we're thinking really hard here, but let's say there's a professor, and like if you take this professor's class, they have an agenda against Christians where they want Christians to not believe in Jesus and to begin to engage in sinful practices or things that would be more secular or worldly. Like that's the professor's goal. Like, hey, if you're a Christian in my class, I'm going to do everything I can to convince you that Jesus isn't real, and I'm going to try to influence you to live a life that's counter to the Christian life. Right? So imagine that there's this professor, right? Now, let's say that Redeemer has a building and we have a storeroom that's meant for feeding the hungry, right? So it's like, hey, on a weekly basis, we go and we feed people who don't have food. And this storeroom is like well stocked. And every week we're out in the community feeding people. Well, eventually, let's say that we're no longer feeding people. And you're like, why does Redeemer not do that on Saturdays anymore? And then, like, you come to the church and you're like, let's see if maybe the storeroom needs to be stocked. And you open up the door and there's a bed and a TV's hung up on the wall. And there's like a futon. I don't know if those are still a thing or not, right? But but it's like a dorm room for that professor. And like, we've just invited that professor and like, hey, come and hang out here. And that professor is now influencing the people of Redeemer. You'd be like, this is really messed up. Do you know what this guy's doing? Like, why are you housing him and bringing his influence into the church? This seems like a bad idea. That's exactly what Israel is doing with bringing in Tobiah. They're bringing in someone who is having a negative influence on God's people. All right, so how does Nehemiah respond to this? As he realizes they have brought in an ungodly influence and they've defiled the temple. It says this in verse 8. And I was very angry, and I threw all the household furniture of Tobiah out of the chamber. Then I gave orders, and they cleansed the chambers, and I brought back there the vessels of the house of God with the grain offering and the frankincense. Right? So Nehemiah's response is anger and action. All right? Anger and action. I don't know if you've ever seen the movies where, a guy really messes up and his like wife takes all of the stuff and throws it out into the yard, right? He comes home, he's like, why is my guitar in the front yard, right? Like that's more or less what's happening. Nehemiah goes straight yard sale on Tobiah's stuff. He's like, throw it out in the yard, all right? Like bring in the Clorox. We got to clean this place, right? And let's bring in the appropriate things. Right? And so he throws out that which is ungodly. He cleanses the space to make it right for God's presence. And then he brings in that which is appropriate for the chamber. All right, so I want to lean in here for a second, okay? I've got two lean in moments today, and I want you to really. So this is me saying, hey, pull it in with me, okay? Pull it in. Here's my question for you. When it comes to Tobiah, Israel had a choice. They could have Tobiah's presence in their lives, or they could have God's presence in their lives. By moving Tobiah in, they were making a very clear statement that they would rather have him than God. So here's my question. Do you have a Tobiah in your life? And I'm not just talking about a person. It could be a person, but is there something in your life that is pulling your heart away from God? Right? Do you have a Tobiah in your life? Something that is influencing your heart away from God's heart. All right. For some people, this might be that you're dating or pursuing a relationship with a non-Christian, right? For others, this could be that you're in a career and you're just constantly violating your conscience, right? Like you're just constantly in violation of your conscience with your job. Maybe for others, it could be media intake, the things that you're filling your mind with, whether it's social media or the TV shows that you're binging or the music you're listening to. Maybe it's a love of money. Like, I don't know what that thing might be for you, but listen to me on this. If you don't radically deal with these things, they will move in, push God out, make themselves comfortable, and eventually callous your heart towards sin. Right? Let me say that again. Like, do you have a Tobiah in your life? Right? If you don't radically deal with it, it will move in, push God out, make itself comfortable, and it will callous your heart towards sin. Okay? So as we keep reading, another way that Israel broke their commitment to separate from ungodly influences was from interreligious marriages. We see that in verses 23 through 31, right? So interreligious marriages where they're marrying people who are of different faiths. All right, look at verse 23 through 25. He says, in those days, I also saw the Jews who had married women of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab, and half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod, and they could not speak the language of Judah, but only the language of each people. Right? So you have believing men who are marrying unbelieving women. So this is interesting. If you want to find a good sociologist to follow for kind of like cultural trends and how things are influencing us, probably the leading sociologist in America right now, or one of the leading sociologists, is out of the University of Virginia, not too far up the road. It's a guy named Bradford Wilcox, right, at UVA. And Bradford Wilcox has shown, I would say conclusively, that when you look at marriages, the highest rates of divorce and the lowest rates of marital satisfaction come between married people who practice different faiths. Right? So we're not like I would say this just is truth that aligns with God's truth. It's like we're discovering that what God says is real, right? But this is think about this. This is verifiable, right? If you are like, hey, I'm a Christian and I'm dating a non-Christian, or I'm a Christian and I wanna be with this person romantically who doesn't love Jesus, I'm telling you, you have a higher rate for divorce, and you're gonna have a marriage that's gonna be very, very, very unsatisfying to you, right? Like, and so here we see is the people who are saying they love God have begun to marry people who don't love God. And what's happening is it's actually not only influencing their hearts, it's beginning to affect their children. Like when you look at their children are more influenced by the ungodly influence than by the godly influence in the home. And so now their kids don't even know the language of God to know his word and to know God's heart. Like this is crazy. And so when Nehemiah hears this, like he is very, very, very upset. We'll come back to that. But here's what I know. I've been in ministry long enough that if you feel like Jeff's talking to me right now, here's what your heart's going to do. If this is you, your heart's going to say, but my case is different. Right? Like that's everyone in here. Like if you feel like I'm speaking to you right now, your natural inclination is to go, well, it's different for me. right? Like, I'm their only chance of ever knowing Jesus. So I'm going to stick it out because I'm going to be like a missionary dater, right? Doesn't work, right? Missionary dating does not work, right? And so what he does is he continues on in verses 26 through 27 to show like King Solomon. He goes, think about King Solomon. King Solomon was the greatest king ever. He had more wisdom in his pinky than you have in your whole body. And King Solomon, in all of his strength and wisdom, was unable to keep his heart from being pulled away from God's heart when he intermarried with other people. Right? And so if King Solomon can't do it, you can't do it. But look at verse 25. This is how Nehemiah responds to their interreligious marriages. And I confronted them and cursed them and beat some of them and pulled out their hair. And I made them take an oath in the name of God, saying, you shall not give your daughters to their sons or take their daughters for your sons or for yourselves. My commentary says this is descriptive, not prescriptive, which I was bummed about. Could you imagine? Like, you see some dudes from Redeemer that are all bruised up, missing hair, and like, what happened? Like, Jeff beat me. Like, pulled my hair out and made me say uncle. Like, he's like, I swear to God. Apparently I can't do that. Also like sizing some of you up right now. I'm like, could I take him out? But this is descriptive, not prescriptive. But we see is that this is radical action. Like Nehemiah is saying, look, to not separate from ungodly influences is a serious, serious thing that must be dealt with radically if necessary. Right? So the first commitment they break is their commitment to separate from ungodly influences. 2, the second commitment they break is they break their commitment to support the house of God. They break their commitment to support the house of God. Look at verses 10 through 14. He says, I also found out that the portions of the Levites had not been given to them, so that the Levites and the singers who did the work had fled each to his field. Right? And so it's biblical to support people who do ministry, right? And because the people who did ministry were not financially supported, they had to return to the fields to a job to make ends meet. But because they were doing another job, they weren't able to do the ministry. So verse 11 says, so I confronted the officials and said, why is the house of God forsaken? And I gathered them together and set them in their stations. Then all of Judah brought the tithe of the grain, wine, and oil into the storehouses, and I appointed as treasurers over the storehouses of Shelemiah the priest, Zadok the scribe, Pedaiah of the Levites, and as their assistant Hanan the son of Zachar, son of Mattaniah, for they were considered reliable, and their duty was to distribute to their brothers. And then he says a little prayer here. Remember me, O my God, concerning this, and do not wipe out my good deeds that I have done for the house of my God and for his services. All right. And so in verses 10 through 14, the people made a commitment to support the work of the Lord, to support the church, and they didn't come through with it. This would be like, it's a capital campaign. You fill out a commitment card and then you never write the check. That's more or less what they're doing here. Okay. So they're not fulfilling their commitment to support the work. And what I love about this particular example is when confronted, what do the people do? They immediately change course. Right? So the first example of the interreligious marriages, Nehemiah has to beat it out of them, right? The second one, their commitment to support the house of the God, when they're confronted with it, they immediately change. And I think this shows us that when we are confronted with sin, we typically respond in one of two ways, right? So when sin is exposed in your life, you're going to respond in one of two ways, right? The right response in verses 10 through 14 is conviction, confession, and change. Right? That's how when you're confronted with sin, the right response is conviction, confession, and change. But another way we're prone to respond is through apathy, denial, and justification. Right? And so as you evaluate your life and as God exposes sinful things, how are you going to respond? Are you going to respond with conviction, confession, and change, or are you going to push back and deny, have no feelings, that you have complete apathy towards it, and try to justify your actions? I've said this once, I'll say it 1,000 more times before I breathe my last breath. When God convicts you, it's like your feet are in wet cement, okay? It's like your feet are in wet and drying cement. The longer you take to move, the harder it's going to get to break free. And so when you are convicted, move forward quickly. Don't wait. It only gets harder the longer you wait. Okay? Now the third commitment they break. So they broke their commitment to separate from ungodly influences. Second, they broke their commitment to support the house of God. And third, we see that they break their commitment to keep the Sabbath. Right? So this is in verses 15 through 22. What we see is that instead of taking a day to rest and worship, they choose to work because they loved money more than they loved God. All right, so look at verses 17 through 18. He says this, "Then I confronted the nobles of Judah and said to them, 'What is this evil thing that you are doing, profaning the Sabbath day? Did not your fathers act in this way, and did not our God bring all this disaster on us, on this city? Now you are bringing more wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath.'" And so what he's reminding them is when Babylon conquered Israel, the primary sin God was punishing them for was their lack of keeping the Sabbath. And he's like, you know this. You know that when you didn't keep the Sabbath, it resulted in the Babylonian exile. And now here you are choosing to profane the Sabbath again. This is more or less like him saying, don't bring this evil on me, Ricky Bobby. Like he's like, don't bring this on me. Like, what are you trying to do by going back to the sin that led to our exile in the first place? And then I love verse 19. All right, this is how Nehemiah responds. "As soon as it began to grow dark, at the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I commanded that the doors should be shut and gave orders that they should not be opened until after the Sabbath. And I stationed some of my servants at the gates that no load might be brought in on the Sabbath day." Have you ever been in a traffic jam where like traffic's stacked up and there's that car that drives down the shoulder and passes everybody? And then have you ever seen a semi truck cut it off? You're like, yeah, like that, like everyone in the line is like, amen to that truck, right? Like I don't know if they talk to each other, like breaker, like move over. But here's what he's doing. He's like, man, you're trying to bypass this and go around the side. I'm just going to move the semi truck over. I'm going to block the gates, lock them. I'm going to keep people from coming into the city to do work on the Sabbath. So Nehemiah is completely blocking their ability to break the Sabbath. Right? Then verse 20 is really important. So don't miss verses 20 through 22. "Then the merchants and the sellers of all kinds of wares lodged outside Jerusalem once or twice." So the merchants and sellers are like, we're just going to camp out here. "But I warned them and said to them, 'Why do you lodge outside the wall? If you do so again, I will lay hands on you,' which we know he will do. From that time on, they did not come on the Sabbath. Then I commanded the Levites that they should purify themselves and come and guard the gates to keep the Sabbath day holy." And then he prays again, "Remember this also in my favor, O my God, and spare me according to the greatness of your steadfast love." This is my second lean in moment here. Okay, so I asked you to lean in on if there is a Tobiah in your life. Let me ask you to lean in again. What did the merchants and sellers do when he blocked off their ability to come into the city? They camped out. So I want you to, like, if I was like a good illustration person, I'd like bring a tent up here. It's not my style. But imagine this, like the merchants and sellers are like, all right, you're going to shut the city. We're just going to kind of camp out right here. Why are they camping? Because they're saying, yeah, you made a commitment to keep the Sabbath holy, but we know you're going to go back on your word. It's just a matter of time. So we're just going to camp out here until you're ready. And then once you're ready, we'll gladly go back to the way things were. I say that because here's what you need to hear. This is where I'm asking you to lean in. What are your temptations? Think about this. Like, what are your temptations? Maybe it's social media. Maybe it's an unhealthy relationship. Maybe it's alcohol. I don't know what your temptation is, but here's what I know. Typically, when you are confronted with this thing is pulling my heart away from God, you're like, I'm going to remove it, right? I'm taking Facebook off my phone, right? Like, I'm not going to drink anymore. Like, you remove it. Listen to me on this. Your temptations will camp out because in their mind, they're saying, you'll come back. So think about it. What are your temptations? When you remove them, trust me, they will camp out because in their mind, they're saying it's just a matter of time before you come back. And here's what we see happening over and over and over again. You bring them back, don't you? But you do so with boundaries. Am I right? You're I'm just going to drink on Fridays now. Or I'm just going to do social media, but I'm going to make sure that my wife has my passcode to my phone, right? Like you put your boundaries in place, and listen to me. Boundaries are like having a t-shirt neck with a big head. They stretch. Okay, so you come back with your boundaries, they're going to stretch over time. And as they stretch, you make more and more room for that temptation to lead you back to exactly where you were before. Like, I'm asking you guys, lean in on this. When there is a temptation in your life, don't bring it back in with boundaries. Remove it. Get it out of your life. And trust me, they will camp out as long as they can until they truly believe you actually have moved on from it. Don't bring them back with boundaries. Your boundaries will simply stretch. And as they stretch, you will find yourself back to where you were in the first place. All right, so as we wrap up Nehemiah, we're trying to land the plane now. We've seen that God wants his people to change the world. Right? He's like, I want you to be a city on a hill. I want you to have a godly influence on the surrounding nations, right? And Israel makes some really big and sincere commitments to be that type of people. They make big commitments, and I believe their commitment was sincere. But what becomes clear in chapter 13, this is the most anti-youth ministry message ever, by the way. Like if you grew up in youth ministry and you've been to youth camp, this is about to completely unravel everything you've ever heard. But listen to me. What Nehemiah 13 exposes is this: the world is much more likely to change us than we are to change it. The world is much more likely to change us than we are to change it. And so as I've been reading Nehemiah, I can't help but to see some parallels to Jesus. So let me connect the dots here. All right? Nehemiah, at the beginning of the book, is at the right hand of the king. And then he chooses to leave the comforts of the kingdom to go and pursue and to rescue his people. As he goes to his people, he accomplishes and finishes the work. Once the work is done, he goes back to the right hand of the king. And now in chapter 13, as he returns for a second time, he discovers that people have gone astray. Jesus was at the right hand of the Father, and he chose to leave the comforts of the kingdom, making himself poor to pursue us. Jesus went and came into history to accomplish a work, to live the perfect life we couldn't live, to die the sinner's death that we deserved, and to raise victorious over the grave, offering us new and eternal life. And after the work was done, he ascended to heaven, where he is now at the right hand of the Father. And Jesus, like Nehemiah, will return a second time. So let me ask you this. If you were to go back in your faith journey, if you were to go back to that first time you gave your life to Christ, right? I want you to think about the commitments that you were making. God, I will never do this again. God, from this day forward, I am yours and I give you all of my heart, right? I want you to think about those commitments you were making, right? Put yourself in those shoes again. When Jesus returns, if he were to return today, what would he see? In relation to the commitments you made back then, what would Jesus see in your life today? So here's my concluding question. When we're confronted with the reality that our hearts have been pulling away from God, when we're confronted with the truth that culture is shaping us more than Christ, when we're confronted with the fact that sin has begun to move in, make itself a home, and to callous our hearts towards God, what is our appropriate response? What's the appropriate response? According to Nehemiah, I would say it's not a time to tolerate or to be polite, but to take action and to destroy sin before it destroys you. Destroy sin before it destroys you. Back in 2003, there was a show in Vegas, Siegfried and Roy. And they had these tigers that they did a show with. But in October of 2003, during a show, this 7-year-old, 400-pound tiger began to walk towards the audience in a way that it wasn't supposed to walk. And so Roy, he goes up to correct the tiger, and the tiger bites his arm. He pops it in the nose and says, "No, no." And then he begins to move the tiger back to its rightful place. The tiger jumps on him, grabs hold of his neck, and drags him bleeding, nearly to death, off the stage. Tigers are predators. We should not be surprised at this. It's like, what happened? It's like it did what it was created to do. Like that's what tigers do. They kill, right? Sin is a predator. Its goal is to destroy your life. And so if you have something in your life right now that's pulling your heart away from God and you think it's cute and cuddly like a tiger cub, you might be thinking, I can cozy up to this. I can manage it. I can put the right boundaries around it. I can do this and still do the God thing. I'm telling you, that thing will grow up to be a 7-year-old, 400-pound tiger that will do what it was created to do, and it will eventually destroy your life. Romans 8:13 more or less tells us to kill sin, or sin will be killing you. Many guys in the room right now have these wristbands that give us Romans 8:13 that says, "For if you live according to the flesh, you will die, but if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live." We have to take radical action to kill sin before sin kills us. So how do we do that? Don't miss verse 22. The prayer says this: "Remember this also in my favor, O my God, and spare me according to the greatness of your steadfast love." Nehemiah's hope for Israel was not in their ability to keep their commitments to God. They broke every single one. His hope for Israel was in God's steadfast love, or his commitment to keep his promises to them. You see, I couldn't help but to think this morning, what an appropriate sermon leading into Easter. Because this week, my hope is that you will do the work of letting sin and temptations and things that are pulling your heart away from God come to the surface. Like, do the work. God, like, what is it that's pulling my heart away? What is it that I need to throw out into the yard? What is it that I need to confront and beat and pull the hair out of? Like, what is it that I need to do something about? And I'm telling you, your power to kill it is not in your strength, but in knowing the love of Christ. And so on Friday, we will look to the cross and we will remember God's great love, that he died to give us freedom, forgiveness, and victory. And then on Easter Sunday, we will celebrate that he has risen and that he has given us new life. You see, if you want to find victory over sin, it doesn't come from your power. It comes from knowing and experiencing the love of Christ, which is what this week is all about. It's a time for us to look to and remember the fullness of God's love for us in such a way that it will radically transform our lives. God, thank you for your word. As we move into a time of response, I ask that you would do a work in all of our hearts. God, bring to mind the sinful things that have moved in and made themselves a home. God, expose in us the temptations that are camping out and just waiting to return. God, give us the strength and courage to take radical action on the things that will one day try to destroy our lives if they haven't already. And God, may the driving force to all of this be knowing your great love that is displayed for us on the cross, because our only hope is your steadfast love. In your name we pray.